Are you thinking about renting out a property, purchasing a property to rent out? Don't know if you should do long-term rental versus short-term rental, which one's got less headaches, which one has a better income yield, more predictability. That's what we're talking about in today's video. Let's get started. Let's start by defining what a short-term rental is versus a long-term rental. Typically, when you think of long-term rental, you're thinking long-term, right? So we're talking about 6 months to a year or even more. Short-term rentals are really less than 30 days. Maybe it's, a weekend, 2 weeks, up to 30 days. And then really there's actually a midterm rental, which is kind of that spot between short-term and long-term. So 30 days to maybe 6 months, give or take. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. So what are some pros of short-term rentals? If you think that you might want to purchase a property in another area so that you can visit and eventually move here, short-term rentals might be good. It's going to allow you more flexibility. When you're not booked, you can decide, hey, I'm going to come in for the summer or I'm going to come down for the winter and stay here and stay at your own property. It's all set up. It'll be furnished, ready to go. You pretty much just bring a few things and you're at your property. It's an Airbnb. You need some clothes. That's about it. Depending on where your short-term rental is, you could have higher income potential. So what I mean by that is certain jurisdictions here, at least in the Tampa Bay area, will have 30-day minimum rentals with a few exceptions. The beaches, certain areas of the beach will allow short-term rentals, and certain areas in Dunedin, as an example, have limited short-term rental zones. So you'll have to check your local jurisdictions and municipalities to make sure that you don't buy something thinking that you could short-term rental this, and in actuality, you cannot, and the minimum lease would be 30 days. Another pro to short-term rentals is the ability to adjust pricing more frequently. What I mean by this is you could have seasonality. If you're maybe here, particularly like the Tampa Bay area in Florida, we have seasons. So we have a higher season for tourists to come in. So you could charge a premium, just like the hotels do. You're no different, than a hotel. And conversely, you're going to have off season potentially. So you need to take a look at what your vacancy rate's going to be if you're purchasing an existing short-term rental, or maybe there's another short-term rental close by. You need to study those vacancy rates and kind of see where they're at. A quick hint to that is you could probably jump on one of the popular short-term rental sites and you could really see how much they're booked out in advance, so you can get a kind of a feel for what the property is doing. Also, you could use an app or log in on the web. It's called AirDNA, and there's a free version and a paid version at the time of this recording. And you could use that to get a better handle on vacancy rates, potential income for the property. And then obviously you're going to have to do your own research when it comes to how much you can get for your short-term rentals. So some cons of short-term rentals: it's going to be more expensive to operate. It doesn't seem like it, but you're going to have higher turnover. So for instance, if you've got somebody coming in, they're staying for 7 days or 6 days, they leave at 10 o'clock in the morning, you're going to have somebody come in there, clean the property, turn it, fix anything that was broken, and then get it ready for your next tenant to come in, typically that afternoon at let's say 3 or 4. So you have a small window to get that turned over. Some problems with that is if you have a staff member or you've hired a company or someone to come in and clean and fix, maybe they call out sick and they don't have a backup, you could have an unhappy customer. And if you don't live local, you might have a hard time trying to get somebody in the moment to go over there and turn the property for you. It's more time intensive for management. More bookings means more bookkeeping. More bookings means more screenings, more paperwork. All those types of things, tax filings. Remember, short-term rentals are subject to a different tax here locally. Check with your local jurisdiction to see what they are if you're buying somewhere outside of the Tampa Bay area. But in general, short-term rentals will have a different tax. It's more of like the hotel tax. Touching on what I already mentioned with off-season, that could lead to an inconsistent income because you have ups and downs in vacancy rates. Don't forget, you're also going to have to pay for marketing. You're trying to market, you're not marketing the property one time, you're marketing the property consistently so that you can get a good, steady flow of customers coming into the property. and you're going to have to furnish the property and fix things, keep things nice. So there could be a little bit higher overhead costs. Regulation changes. A few years ago, we went through a huge regulation change, and in my opinion, it really kind of hurt our short-term rental market. Now, I completely understand why it was done, because a lot of people don't want basically a hotel right next to their house, next door. So my house next door, and I've got somebody new coming in every single weekend. I don't live in a tourist area by definition. Like, I don't live on Clearwater Beach. I don't live in downtown Dunedin or downtown Safety Harbor, as an example, where it's kind of expected somewhat. But those zones. So just something to think about, that regulations can change, and that could hurt your income potential as a short-term rental. So have a contingency plan. Let's talk about some pros of long-term rentals. First and foremost, that's probably on your mind right now is, what's my income? Well, you're probably going to have a more predictable income with a long-term rental, simply because you've got a tenant in there for 12 months, 6 months maybe, but that they're there. And then they also have the ability to renew their lease. And what your monthly payments are going to be for the next 12 months. So you can put a budget in place for 12 months. And then as the year goes on, pay attention to other occupancies, how long they're staying vacant, and how long or where the pricing point is going. Is it going up? Is it going down? And of course, you've got lower operational effort when it comes to long-term rentals compared to the higher turnover rate and screening rate with your short-term rentals. You're going to just have one application or maybe a couple applications while you're advertising the property when it's vacant or just before your tenant moves out and gives you notice. That's another plus. The tenant's going to tell you when they're leaving. In your lease, you should have, at least we do here, you should have a notice of intent to leave. And you're going to communicate with your tenant and say, hey, your lease is coming up in a few months. Do you intend on leaving? Typically, it's a 30 to 60 day. Just make sure you check your lease that you're using here in Florida for your tenant to see what that mandatory notification is going to be for you. But you can plan. Everything has the ability to plan because it is a long-term lease. Also, with a long-term lease, typically the tenant is going to be responsible for utilities compared to an Airbnb. You might be charging more on the upfront for your Airbnb, but you have to pay your own utilities, your own water, and if it's not being paid for by the tenant, then maybe they're going to take that extra long hot shower or crank that AC down or crank that heat up, and it could drive your bills up. And then of course, with long-term rentals, you typically have fewer legal hurdles when it comes to fluctuating rules and regulations. If you're in an HOA, the HOA may try to change some rules. I know here in Wesley Chapel, there was an HOA that attempted to change some rental rules. And what they did is they weren't banning rentals, but they were doing a rental percentage. So they were trying to pass, let's say, and as an example, only 10% of the homes could be rented at any one given time. If your HOA does something like that, basically what that means is, let's say there's another 2 homes that are on the waiting list. Well, they're going to rotate up, and then you're at the top of the list. When your tenant moves out, you're going to rotate to the bottom. So you could actually have a much longer vacancy rate. So you could have almost a year vacancy rate potentially, or more, if your HOA does that. Now, it's relatively rare that they do this because that's a big change. And for the most part, I don't see neighborhoods switching over to rental neighborhoods, but it's not unheard of. So pay attention to your HOA, even though it's a rental property. Pay attention to what's going on in your HOA. Make sure you're active in your HOA, even if it's by proxy, so that you can get somebody to represent you when there is a vote, because your voice does count and you do need to pay attention to those things. And watch out, that is a potential pitfall. Some of the other things that you can have the tenant responsible for, personally, I don't recommend this, is lawn maintenance and plant, shrub trimming, etc. Just pay somebody to do it. Number one, you don't want the tenant to get hurt. Number two, you want a professional out there making sure that the sprinklers are working correctly, the lawn's getting mowed, the fertilizer's down, pest control is taken care of. There's some things that are just part of an expense for running and having an investment property. And that's one of those that I strongly recommend you just hire that out. Don't make the tenant do that stuff. Again, it's going to kind of depend on where you're at, or maybe you don't even have yard. Now, some more cons of long-term rentals. Obviously, you could limit your earning potential depending on where you're at. So if you're out here, let's say you're out here in Wesley Chapel and you're trying to do a short-term rental, you're probably not going to do very well. We don't have an attraction for somebody to come in and rent for 1 week or a weekend. There's just nothing here that people would typically do that for. Maybe they're coming in for a weekend to visit family, but we have plenty of hotels around here, and it's not going to be the strongest point, so I wouldn't recommend that out here. But if you're in Dunedin, or you're on Clearwater Beach, Indian Rocks Beach, even close to the coastal towns, that might be an option. But then there's those zones, so just make sure you pay attention to those. And then obviously with a long-term rental, you're going to have less flexibility with your ability to come down here and stay in your own property, because you have a tenant there and you can't just get rid of them at a whim because you want to come back down here and spend a weekend. So they're there. It's a rental. You know, you're free to stop by and check on your house and things like that from time to time with appropriate notice, but it does limit your flexibility if it's something that you want to use as potentially a vacation spot. But you can also, to kind of overcome those things, you could maybe get involved with a business or a management company, a temp service where they bring in executives or something along those lines. And because they're looking for a permanent residence, so they need that mid to short-term rental, or maybe they'll do 8 months, and you could work a deal out that way so that you could at least maybe get some of your expenses covered by a tenant for the property. And then obviously, because you're into a 1-year lease, if tenancy rates go through the roof and rent rates go through the roof with it, you can't change while you're in a lease. You've got to wait till there's a renewal. And then you run the risk, if you have a giant spike, you have to think about that tenant's going to leave. So when you're doing math on those things, just remember, when you have a tenant leave, you may want to jump, let's say you want to jump that rental rate up. Like, let's, as an example, $200. And you have to be really careful at how much you want to raise your rent. And I do recommend, but most of the time, raising your rent, because your expenses every year go up. This year alone, I think in our area, we had a 23-ish some odd percent increase just in insurance. Utility bills went up 20+% this year as well, or 2024. And those, you have to take that into consideration, because you're renting your property to make money or not lose money or lose as much money. Obviously, we want to make money with the rental. That's why you're doing it, to build a portfolio. Conversely, you also have to remember, maybe you're not making and clearing $1,200, $1,300, $1,400 a month, but you also have somebody paying off your debt for the asset. And that's a whole separate video that we can talk about. So some key considerations when choosing a short-term versus a long-term rental. Number one, obviously identify your goals. Get out a pen and paper, write it down. What are some of your goals? What are some of your concerns? And then start to research those things and really understand the market. You're going to have to understand the market on both ends. But if you're trying to do a short-term rental in Wesley Chapel, it's probably not going to be feasible. You're going to have a lot of vacancy. If you're trying to do a long-term rental in Wesley Chapel, you're going to have pretty good luck. It doesn't take too long to get those properties rented. And something else I almost forgot to mention, but just remember, it becomes a little bit more of a hurdle sometimes to, show the property, because there is a tenant in the property. You've got to give 24 hours notice, which is a requirement here in our jurisdiction, before we can even come in. So it does add a little bit of complexity when it comes to showings before you do turn the property. And another consideration would be time commitment for you. If you're going to pay a management company, it might not be so bad. But if you're going to manage some of the property yourself, or even if you're local and you're going to do some of the maintenance to keep some of your costs down, just remember time commitment. If you don't have a ton of time, you're going to have to pay somebody to do things. Long-term rentals might be a better choice for you, just because you only have to kind of book it. You know it's coming, and when the tenant's leaving, and you can kind of schedule the time off. Hopefully that answers some questions, or maybe it raised a few more questions because you got a little bit more information. That would be great. Feel free to ask them in the comments. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'd love to chat. And that's today's video. Stay tuned for our next video. I'll pop it up right over here in the corner. Until next time, please comment, like, and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next video.